Some people fall in love slowly. We fell in love like a mistake waiting to happen. For months, Blair and I perfected the art of almost destroying each other. In meetings, in deadlines, in every sharp look across a conference table. She called me rigid. I called her reckless. And somehow, we kept winning. Together. We were rivals. Competitive, untouchable. Safe behind sarcasm and professional distance. Until one night, long after everyone else went home, she stepped too close. And the tension we'd been pretending not to feel stopped feeling like hate. It felt like hunger. Now there's a stolen project, a career on the line, and a secret neither of us can afford to admit. Especially when the only person I trust might also be the one capable of ruining me completely. Because the real problem isn't our rivalry anymore. It's that I don't know where the fight ends, and where wanting her begins. I'm pressed against the glass wall of the conference room. The city a scatter of sodium and office lights beyond Blair's shoulder. And for one terrible, luminous second, all my plans for the night collapse into the way her hand splayed flat beside my head. I am a strategist. I keep maps of possibilities in my head. Routes, contingencies, safe exits. I know how to predict the moves people make before they make them. Tonight, none of that helps. Her sandalwood perfume folds into the smell of cold coffee. There's the faint tang of copper in the air from the mug I haven't put down. In the dark, her pupils flare like coin slots. She is a paradox I can't taxonomize. Impatient with systems, surgical with color, a thief of deadlines and of whatever quiet I thought I had left in me. You realize you look ridiculous arguing with a chair at midnight, she says. And her voice is the kind that counts syllables even when it pretends not to. She isn't smiling. Not exactly. The corner of her mouth is plotting. I was winning, I say, which is technically true. I pull out a stat. Our timeline shaved 30% of buffer time. And I prefer not to be interrupted by aesthetic whims. Your aesthetic is spreadsheets with flowers. She flicks a marker cap like a blade. The motion shouldn't be sexy, but it is. Part theater, part invitation. The marker clicks against the table. It sounds impossibly loud. We have been enemies longer than we've been in the office together. Enemies is dramatic, sure. Rivals is more accurate. Though to call what we are, clinical would be to ignore the small, incendiary ways she undermines me. A pointed critique at the weekly review, a sketch that reframes my proposal and makes it look, absurdly, like art, a sideways compliment designed to sting. There's chemistry there, forceful, dangerous, but it always arrived with an accompanying agenda. She's unpredictability with eyeliner. The Phoenix project landed on our desk because Linda likes conflict almost as much as she likes results. Linda believed, correctly, that combining my methodical spine with Blair's incendiary eye would produce something fierce. It was a corporate experiment dressed as a promotion. The prize on the line was more than a nice title. It was a fast track to a role that would change the geometry of my life. More travel, more clients, the kind of influence that makes building a career irreversible. To win meant assimilating into the machine I had spent years mapping. We were given 45 days and a single intimidating client, a luxury hospitality brand that wanted to pivot toward experiential authenticity without sounding like a brochure written by a consultant with a thesaurus. They wanted vision without pretense, and they wanted it yesterday. Listen, Blair says now. Her knuckles are warm near my ear. You and me? We are never going to leave anything in a folder titled Potential again. Ever. She leans in. Not a threat, not yet. An alignment. Everything I had learned about not letting people map me, about not letting someone else define risk, suddenly looks like a choice I could make. There, in the fluorescent residue of the empty conference room, is where the paradox reboots. The rules between us have always been adversarial. I strike at strategy, she counters with the human heart of the idea. We demolish each other's assumptions, and then build something surprising out of the debris. In that container, intimacy has erupted before. But this is different. This is the first time the friction between us has literalized into proximity so conspicuous that the city can watch. I swallow. My mouth tastes like burnt sugar and office adrenaline. My hand finds the edge of the glass, fingers splayed like a casualty analysis. I could step back. I could run through the possible consequences like a flowchart. Instead, I let the moment exist without evaluating it, for a minute shorter than a breath. She's backed me into a corner and somehow made me forget the geography of my escape routes. For once, I stop measuring and start noticing. If you like this kind of slow burn WLW story, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. We had met as most professional hostilities germinate, under an LED-lit projector and a 5-slide argument. Blair had walked in late, hair a careless halo, eyes like an accusation. She'd unrolled her tablet with the ease of someone who believed the world could be reshaped on a layer. I remember thinking, in that instant, how dangerous that belief was. Dangerous because it was magnetic, and I had been trained to be, anti-magnetic. Our first week on Phoenix was a tangle of compromises that read, from the outside, like a textbook case of creative synergy. From the inside, it felt like a battlefield. Meetings were cages marked by my metric-driven timelines and her evocative mood boards. She would sketch a mood, and I would translate it into numbers. She would call me rigid, I would call her reckless. Linda would circle the room with the satisfied expression of a beekeeper, watching buzzy genius. "Who do you think you're talking to?" Blair had asked when I'd suggested cutting their event budget by 15%. "Are you actually trying to be the most boring person in a room full of possibility?" "I am trying to be the most effective person in a room full of impossible deadlines," I said. "We're not curating a museum, Blair. We're selling a living experience." She snorted. "Everything's an experience to you. Because that's how you monetize intention." Her eyebrows rose, which is Blair speak for, "That's an interesting worldview you're having." Inside that, there was a softness, a willingness even to listen. That first week, the edges softened because we needed to. There were deliverables, and the client wanted drafts sooner than we liked. We began to trade in shorter sentences and faster feedback. She surprised me with a lunch of bad paninis and a perfect criticism of the graphic direction I'd championed. I answered with a spreadsheet that made our budget sing. We were good together in the way two different instruments make a chord. Noisy, sometimes dissonant, often unexpected, but whole. Outside of meetings, I kept my guard high. I measure my life in proposals and exit strategies. Emotions are a liability. My parents had provided the architecture, logic, order, the quiet prestige of an uninterrupted upward climb. My father likes to remind me that he never had to ask for a seat. He was given one because he checked the right boxes. My mother paints watercolors on vacation and calls me practical with a tenderness that has always made room for me. They are proud of what I plan to be. They are, all the same, a compass whose needle insists I don't drift. Blair offered, by contrast, an atlas with entire uncatalogued regions. She told me, late one night when we'd both been beating our heads against a client brief, the story of art school in Seattle, where she learned how to make color make people move. She could talk about saturation like a prayer. Her hands laughed when she told stories, small, quick gestures that colored the air. "My professor told me once," she said, gripping her coffee cup so tight the paint on the rim left a reservation, "that the safest design is the one that disappears. It's forgettable. I don't want to disappear." "Then don't," I said. It felt like an instruction more than a reply. She looked at me the way she looks at an empty white canvas. Possibility, calculation, dare. That's what you like about me, isn't it? My refusal to disappear. I didn't answer because it would have revealed too much. But I didn't push away either. We began to meet outside of work, by accident at first, an elevator that closed a hair's breadth with us inside, a table at an Italian place where a waiter assumed we were in a relationship because we were loud together. Friends misread the easy rhythm between us for a slow-build romance long before I would let myself see it as anything but complication. It wasn't that the attraction was sudden. It had been there in the early barbs and the way she rearranged the art direction to make my PowerPoint look like something people would remember. It was in the way she watched me in the staff kitchen while I microwaved last night's dinner and pretended not to note my nervous energy. It lived in the small transgressions, fingers lingering a second too long on a stack of printouts, her laughing at the precise line where my sarcasm thinned into honesty. There are codes in offices, unwritten permissions. We broke them in the protective safety of low consequence. We shared playlists like contraband. I introduced her to a slow, methodical playlist that tracks the time we spend editing each other's copy. She introduced me to music that made my chest ache. It was art that whispered and made promises without spelling them out. At times I chastised myself for the softness I'd allowed. There was a calculus to this. If I misstepped, if I let vulnerability show in a place where scrapping for a promotion meant everything, I could lose my leverage. But vulnerability is a contagion. Once one person dares it, the other begins to follow. The close calls multiplied. In a brainstorming session after midnight, she took my hand, cold at first from the air conditioning, and used it to anchor a diagram on the whiteboard. My pulse sprinted. I kept talking. Later, when we were rewriting copy, her knee brushed mine under the table. There was an escalation to these moments, a tide that rose where previously there had been a manageable current. We were committed to the project, but the project began to become the terrain where something else was happening. The lines between professional and personal blurred in the way a watercolor bleeds into wet paper. Impossible to reverse without evidence of the original. We tried to keep things silent. For both of us, discretion felt necessary, pregnant with possibility, and also precarious because our client's success would place us side by side under Linda's microscope. There was, too, the professional anatomy of our roles. I would be judged for any lapse in discipline. She would be judged for anything that made the work look like a whim. Secrets were a reasonable strategy, but secrecy has its own toxins. It requires lies, breeds guilt, and builds an internal narrative that insists the truth, if told, will be catastrophic. We told small lies, late at the office for dinner, collaborating for staying to talk, and still, the way we rearranged our lives to fit the other felt reckless. The first week we worked through a Sunday. Our heads were a mix of caffeine and creative adrenaline. It was raining. The city looked anonymous from the conference room, the lights blurring into streaks that made the windows look like smeared glass. Blair and I had argued for an hour about the hero image. I wanted restraint. She wanted presence. I had a layout ready that would be efficient. She had a photograph that would be messy and human. "Fine," I said finally, more fatigued than proud. "We do your image, but we scale the margins. Give me the assets and I will make them sing." She smiled, this time a full, dangerous thing. "Bring your spreadsheets to my loft tomorrow. It's easier to mix a palette when you can actually see the light you want to recreate." I almost declined. The tactical side of me cataloged reasons to say no. It's after hours, it's a boundary, it's stupid to conflate private and professional. Then I pictured her hands moving over color swatches, and something inside me unlatched. "I'll bring the metrics," I said, "and snacks. If you're lucky, it'll be crumbs." She laughed in a way that suggested she'd been waiting for this permission. "Worth it," she said. "You'll see." Her loft was exactly what you'd expect of an artist who had never let pragmatism snip the edges of self-expression. East-facing windows that let morning spill in like paint, a drafting table strewn with sketches, a kitchen counter with jars of brushes. There was the smell of turpentine and laundry detergent, which was oddly domestic. There were canvases stacked like pages of some private life I hadn't been invited to read until then. She was barefoot, sleeves rolled, hair a messy halo. She had paint on her thumb like a badge. She poured me coffee that was too strong and handed me a mug with a phrase on it that read, in jaunty font, "Plan B is a state of mind. I wanted to argue the merits of Plan A, but she handed me a color swatch and said, "There's a blue I want to use that will make people feel like they've been kissed by the ocean." We ate takeout off a thrift shop plate, and I told her about the architecture of my decisions, the logic that had gotten me here. I didn't tell her everything. I never tell anyone everything. But I told her enough. About a scholarship I hadn't taken because it would have cost my family, about the quiet satisfaction of aligning a project around a narrative that made sense to more than me. She told me about making a mural in Seattle that people had said was too bright. They told me it was garish, she said, tracing a line in the condensation on her mug. And then someone came by who'd been in the hospital a long time and told me they could finally sleep with the light on because that color made them feel less invisible. I could see, in that anecdote, the map of why she moved through the world the way she did. She chased responses. She wanted to make impressions that behaved like magnets. That was a dangerous profession for an enemy of systems, because it invited unpredictability and dependency. People feeling things because of your choices meant you were responsible for them in a way logic never is. When I left her loft that night, the sky was uncommitted. I had told myself it would be a professional visit, that what happened in the murk of late-night collaboration was a transaction in persuasive design. But I had walked out with her scarf wound in my bag, and a new awareness that my pulse did something interesting when she spoke about color in terms of touch. There was a mix of exhilaration and dread to the days that followed. We worked like two people on a secret revolt. In client calls, we were seamless. Our tensions had become a font of energy. When the client asked for more risk, Blair supplied bravado. I supplied hedging that made that risk sellable. She would push the concept, win or lose, with an intention that smelt of recklessness, and I would carve a stairway out of it so the board could actually buy in. Of course, this produced enemies. Jason and Rachel, the other team leads, saw us as an alliance that threatened their domain. Jason in particular kept a habit of complimenting our drafts in the boardroom in a way that felt like he was marking them as his intended rivals. "Nice work, you two," he'd say, then smile in a manner best described as predatory. He had the sort of career built on chess pieces that moved people. Rachel wrote emails that suggested we were reckless with client budgets, and one of them ended up in Linda's inbox with the kind of deliberate phrasing that reads suspicious even when it's accurate. One morning, after a particularly brutal set of comments from Rachel, we found our shared drive had duplicate folders and one of our crucial assets missing. Blair's face went cold in a way I had not seen before. We traced the problem. Marcus, our dev, handed us access logs and said, "Someone's been poking around in the archive. Timestamp's out of order. Could be a syncing issue, could be more." "Or could be human," Blair said. She does not like the idea of incompetence when something feels intentional. She measured the server logs the way she measures composition, with suspicion and a willingness to notice details others might consider irrelevant. I pulled up the logs and found a pattern, a late-night access from a remote IP that matched to the minute when someone else on the other team had had access. It's astonishing how fast suspicion can harden into accusation in the white heat of a deadline. We didn't point fingers, not yet, but our insides tightened. "We'll handle it," I said. I meant it, and I already had steps laying in my head. Backups, encryption, timestamps, copies to legal. My default is always mitigation. My mind is a ledger. It wants to account for harm before it arrives. Blair rolled up the sleeves of her hoodie and said quietly, "If someone wants to make us look negligent, they'll try again. And if they do, we'll catch them." There was a present tense intimacy in that, a shared resolve. It felt less like romance and more like an oath. Taking oaths with another person, without name, without ceremony, has a peculiar gravity. In my life, oaths had always belonged to institutions, not to individuals. This felt dangerous, thrilling, a risk with teeth. Problems have a way of forging attachments. There's a brutal logic to adversity. Together, you either sink or buoy one another. It is efficient, intimate work. Blair and I spent 2 nights straight building redundancies. She sat cross-legged on the boardroom table, tracing the layout of the customer journey with a colored pen, the kind of thing that might be mocked in another team as frivolous. But it spoke to how she thought, in layers, in feeling, in the way people would move through an experience and then tell their friends about it. On the second morning, exhausted and wired, we found ourselves laughing at an absurdity only we seemed to notice, how ridiculous our professional lives looked when reduced to a string of file names and contentious comments. "Riley," Blair said, "we're the most adult thing in this office that still believes in fairy dust." "Fairy dust with version control," I said. Her laugh came out as an exhale, and for a moment I believed, foolishly, that the world might allow us both the project and the kind of unexpected proximity that was intoxicating without consequence. There's an economy to temptation. You spend days building buffers because you believe that if something happens, the buffer will save you. You also build walls because safety is a commodity. You can test the strength of a wall only by trying to get through it. I think we both started trying around the same time. One evening, after an especially vitriolic email from Jason accusing us of creative liberties that had bordered on intellectual overreach, Linda called an emergency meeting. Her voice over the phone was tight, the way someone with executive responsibilities tightens when they feel a fault line beneath their feet. "I want both of you in the conference room, now." We entered together, Blair and I, not yet coordinated but aware of the importance of a unified front. Linda's eyes swept the room with the clinical assessment of someone who has seen too many instances of a brilliant concept being derailed by personality. "I'm disappointed," she said, letting the sentence dangle like a verdict. "The client has received a partial upload that was not ours, and our account shows an access pattern inconsistent with our workflow. Jason's team denies this, of course, but these are the allegations. I need to know, did anyone make an unauthorized transfer?" I felt the pressure like a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't accusatory yet. The room was a vacuum of possibility. Blair opened her mouth, 1,000 replies in readiness. I kept my answers measured. We provided logs, timestamps, who had been in the system at what time. We were transparent. In a world where secrecy often concealed guilt, transparency announced confidence. But transparency doesn't always equal innocence. Linda's brow did not smooth. She had to act not only on evidence, but on perception. The client loved the concept and hated being uncertain. We were told, gently and with the kind of ruthless practical love that defines corporations, that until the matter was cleared, we would not be the public-facing leads on some aspects of the project. They were reassigned to another team until further notice. Walking out of that meeting felt like being unstitched. For the first time, the project, our project, was not fully ours. The rules I had set for myself: never make vulnerability public, never let emotion be the basis for judgment, felt less like strategies and more like bartering chips with someone who had already called my bluff. Blair's hand found mine as we left. It was a small, charged contact. We didn't speak of the demotion in the elevator. Instead, we clung to the ordinary, a joke about a misfiled mock-up, a plan to trace the access logs again. But proximity had shifted. Where once there had been friction, there was now an alliance that tasted of fear and something deeper, insinuating. "Let's go to my loft," she said finally. "We work better when we're not in a room with fluorescent lighting making everything look sad." I wanted to argue, to suggest that the right call was to hand the logs to legal and let them do their work. Instead, I nodded. If work was the excuse, then the excuse was good enough. There was something about us in a private sunlight place that made the calculations less rigid and the atmosphere more human. At her loft, over instant noodles and the residue of anxiety, we planned. We pulled up logs, made copies, and composed a note for Linda not as a defense but as a dossier. There was an intimacy in the task. Hands moving close, her breath against my ear as she read a line aloud. At one point, we paused, two people leaning into the gravity we were both trying to ignore. I felt it then, as if electricity threaded between us in tidy increments. "Riley," she said, and her voice was softer than a spreadsheet line item. "If it were just me, I'd storm in and ask for retribution." She smiled, half rueful, half pleading. "But we have to be smart." "I'm always smart," I said, though it's not true. Blair's way of making me small was not in diminishing my competence. It was in making me want to gamble with the parts of me I usually never fold. We didn't kiss then. We didn't cross the line into a public intimacy that would complicate more than it would clarify. Still, the night rewired something in both of us. It set a precedent that when the world tilted, legalities, accusations, career-threatening humiliations, we would turn toward one another. When I left that night, the city had decided to stop giving us secrets. Rain had cleared the horizon and left the lights brittle. I clutched my scarf, and her loft keys felt like a temporary emblem lodged in my pocket. Keys are strange talismans. In them we compress trust, possibility, and a future we are unwilling yet to define. Over the next week, our collaboration became a kind of dance of risk and calculation. We guarded our approach to Linda with evidence, bolstered our case with facts, and learned how to defend the territory without exposing the tenderness pooling beneath. The client demanded answers. We produced them with the kind of care that suggested innocence. Marcus ran logs. Piper coached me to be less afraid of public vulnerability. Piper has the bluntness of a friend who knows your tendencies and refuses to be lulled. "You never know what's going to push you over the edge," she told me in a quiet hallway. "Sometimes it's not the argument that does it. It's the person who doesn't run from you when everything falls apart." Piper's intervention was shrewd. She doesn't believe in romance. She believes in results. And yet she saw us. She cornered me one morning with a cup of coffee and said, "You two are doing the courtship of people who keep their hands on the lighthouse. Either you own it or stop hiding. The longer you hide, the worse it will look when it unravels." Her logic was merciless, and in ways practical I appreciated. Pride and caution are twin sins for someone like me. She forced my hand toward confession, though not in the sort of public apology Linda required, rather a quieter admission to myself, that I wanted to try something I had been trained to weigh and postpone. There were small, glorious infractions on top of the larger anxieties. A reckless text from Blair that read, "If we get through this, first round of drinks are on me," and the way I found myself composing a response that wasn't about risk mitigation. We shared a playlist that made mundane working hours seem like a film. We had a ritual. Midnight coffee, one of us at the whiteboard and the other correcting copy. Fingers brushing over markers, hands colliding on the same printout as if by accident. Each accidental touch stoked whatever ember had been glowing under the ash of hostility. And yet, there remained the pragmatic architecture of my life. A promotion would change everything. I kept tally. How many points of leverage I would earn, which clients I'd have to charm more gracefully. The precise update in my LinkedIn profile that would make my parents proud. My calculations never disappeared. They simply began to coexist uneasily with something that felt like desire. There is a moment in building a plan when you recognize variables you did not expect to account for, and romance is a variable that refuses to be modeled. It is irrational and beautiful and dangerous all at once. I found myself rewriting projections to include the line item, potential, Blair's presence. We survived the client scare with our dignity intact. The evidence cleared. The logs pointed to a misconfigured server in a third-party integration. Linda moved with pale satisfaction to reassign missteps back to infrastructure and away from our necks. Jason and Rachel were silent in a way that suggested they'd been embarrassed into inaction rather than convinced. We were reinstated, and the project breathed again. But the moment the project was safe, something else began to pinch. The friction that had once energized us now presented itself as the fact of desire. We were less strangers in a professional sparring ring, and more two people who had, through pressure, created a seam of intimacy neither had dared to pull. There was a tenderness in the way Blair checked my calendar now, a kind of proprietorship that did not want my availability to be interrupted by anything besides the work we were building. I felt a corresponding protectiveness. Protectiveness meant more than guarding data. It meant tending to someone whose hands could ruin you if she wanted, and whose hands also could comfort. And then came the night I had in my mind, both dreaded and wanted. We were finishing a late run of deliverables. The team had dwindled to us and Marcus. The rest had surrendered to sleep. The office was a trough of humming machines and a greenish glow from screens. It was the kind of quiet that optimalists mistake for sleep and critics call the lull before collapse. Blair had been making notes with a marker, drawing a line where the experiential flow needed a human interruption. I was cleaning up a deck, making sure the margins were just so. Words are finite and gestural in the dark. Our breaths were a metronome. She turned to me. There was a serious thing in her face I hadn't seen before. An attentive, dangerous sincerity. "Do you ever think," she asked, "that we're incredibly bad at being moral people in an immoral system? Or is that just me being melodramatic at 2 a.m.? "I'm a moral person," I said, and then, unwilling to be self-congratulatory, added, "I just prefer my morality to be written down." "That explains the bind you get yourself into," she said, and the corner of her mouth softened. "Because I'm moral by accident. I'm moral because the idea of hurting someone makes me physically nauseous." I wanted to tell her that I thought she was the most honest person I knew. Instead, I said, "We're both useful in this. You're the impulse that makes things human. I'm the strategy that makes them possible. Together, we make an offer the client can't refuse." She laughed, and the sound was an invitation. She stepped closer, fewer inches between us than were professional, closer than I had ever allowed anyone. Her palm rested against the glass, and then against mine. Her skin was cool, calloused in the places paintbrushes had claimed. "You look good under fluorescent light," she murmured. It should have been a throwaway compliment. Instead, the words rearranged the room. I could feel my own heartbeat. There is a metric for acoustics and for tension. This felt like the kind of data you could only measure with a fist to the chest. Her face tilted, and the office fell away in that ritual way settings do when two people decide to do something that will change them. I thought of my parents, of my career, of the way my life had been a series of linear steps. I thought of the cost of happiness, of the exact price of a spontaneous choice. But I also thought of the way Blair had held my hand when the server logs had looked like a betrayal. There are moments that require a trade. I had prepared spreadsheets for everything except this particular exchange. She was close enough that I could read the tiny details of her expression, the fleck of paint she hadn't noticed on her eyebrow, the tremor in her lower lip as if she were tasting something brave. I tasted fear and longing, and the odd sensation of being seen not as a set of capacities, but as a person. Then, like a mechanism springing after months of tension, she moved. Her palm flattened beside my face on the glass, and she leaned in as if to press her forehead to mine. It was tender, a gesture of closeness rather than conquest. But then she hesitated, searching my features, looking for permission. Consent is a choreography we both had to practice. Ours had been signaled in small ways, a permission granted by proximity, by a hand not withdrawn. I felt the map of my life reconfigure. I could have stepped away, have mentioned the absurdity of workplace romances, the fear of letting passion rewrite the margins of an otherwise orderly career. Instead, the strategist in me recalculated risk in terms I had not previously allowed. Potential for gain beyond promotion, a different kind of success measured in mornings that I could share. "Are you sure?" I asked, the question not rhetorical. I needed to know this was not a mistake. She smiled, the same soft, dangerous smile, and said, "Always." We closed the distance. Her lips were at my temple first, a soft brush that felt like an exhale. Then she turned her head and kissed me at the jawline, at the place where decision sits by habit. The kiss was small at first, as if we were testing the structural integrity of our own boundaries. It was emphatic enough that my breath caught. Neither of us pulled away immediately. There was consent in the rhythm of our bodies. There was also a consultation, micro-affirmations, a nod without words. We had been adversaries. We had been collaborators. Now we were something else, a wordless occupation of the same space. I thought, absurdly, about the practicalities, our LinkedIn profiles, how our colleagues would respond, the likelihood Linda would feel betrayed if she found out. Practicality is never far from my thought. But practicality also needed to be balanced against this sensation that redefined what counted as a victory. The office lights hummed. The windows were a dark glass of the city beyond. There, pressed together, agreement and danger braided into something neither of us had foreseen. It was, in equal measure, terrifying and inevitable. We broke apart before anything else could happen. Two professionals returning, for now, to the architecture they knew. Neither of us wanted to weaponize the moment into rumor. We agreed, silently, to a separation between what we did in the moonlight and what the day would hold. The first kiss, small, decisive, changed the calculus. We were no longer merely teammates. We had introduced a variable that would now shape every meeting, every strategic decision. The Phoenix Project was supposed to transform a brand. It had transformed us instead. The next morning, the office was all banalities. Buzzers, someone microwaving fish, the thud of heels on the corridor. But beneath those details, there was a hum. We walked into the Monday meeting with a new awareness in the way we stood near each other at the coffee station, in the way we passed documents hands briefly meeting. We kept our faces steady. We kept our mouths to the work. Still, the universe has a poor sense of timing. 2 days later, a file went missing. Not corrupted this time, not an innocent syncing error. An entire presentation deck disappeared from our shared drive, and a version with our concept and images found its way into a client's inbox with a note that suggested it had been leaked. Alarm bells that had once been distant became sirens. Linda called another emergency meeting. Marcus, pale and steady, printed logs that showed an access pattern, with timestamps almost too neat to be likely. Jason and Rachel looked contrite, but there was a sheen to Jason's apology that reeked of calculation. "We will find who did this," Linda said, not waiting for a plea. "And until then, we have to manage client trust. This is not about you personally. This is a process. But process can bruise people who are already tender." And now, with our secret sealing us together in ways we had tried to keep compartmentalized, the stakes felt unlivable. If our private arrangement became a subject of corporate gossip, if our reputations were weaponized as evidence of collusion, our careers could be the collateral. That night Blair texted, "Are you awake?" My thumb hovered over 1,000 responsible responses, and then tapped, "Yes." She wrote back, "Are you coming over?" I sat with my palm on the phone, feeling like my body had become a ledger of impulses and liabilities. I thought of the terms I would have to check off if I stayed in. I thought of all the possible scandal scenarios mapped by the cautionary circuits in my head. I thought, too, of us, of the way we'd both promised to be smart. Then I did a thing I would have once coded as reckless. I put on a sweater that smelled vaguely like my father's cologne and walked to her loft. The city felt enormous and empty enough to hold the consequences. I told myself the move was tactical, that meeting in private would give us time to plan. In truth, I wanted the warmth of her in a way that could not be archived. When I arrived, she had candles lit, not many, enough to be deliberate without being theatrical. The apartment felt less like a workplace now, and more like a place that had been altered since our last visit. A scarf left draped over a chair, a cup rinsed mid-article. We stood in the doorway for a second, two people aware of the day and the nightmare that might follow it. "Tonight feels like a crucible," she said, which is the sort of description she'd use to make a crisis sound like a painting. "We can either let it burn us, or we can find what survives." I wanted to say that I had a plan for the latter. I wanted to say I'd drafted contingencies and legal strategies. Instead, I reached for her hand, and she didn't withdraw it. We sat, for hours, tracing the edges of a problem that could swallow careers like a gray tide. I had the urge, naive and urgent, to solve it in a way that didn't force either of us to give up what mattered. We traced the problem like surgeons mapping a wound. Marcus pulled up every log he could think to query. Piper sat cross-legged on the floor with 3 legal pads and a blunt, consoling expression. Blair and I moved through the data like 2 people reading an unfamiliar language and discovering we knew the same alphabet. We copied files, we salted metadata, we printed everything twice. We made a dossier that would be annoying for anybody to dismiss. Timestamps, IP addresses, user sessions, a trail that, if followed, would lead someone to the particular hands that had touched our work. It was exhausting in a meticulous way, my favorite kind of exhausting, and comforting in the particular quiet assurance that comes when a plan is in motion. We were good at containment. We were less practiced at the way containment could feel like armor for something tender underneath. Every time our fingers brushed over a keyboard tray at the same time, there was a tiny redoubling of attention that had nothing to do with the client. We thought the evidence would be enough. We thought the truth, marshaled in neat chronological order, would absolve us and unmask what I'd started to suspect. This had been orchestrated. The patterns had intention, not accident. The remote IP pointed to a terminal in a conference room on the 15th floor. The timestamps matched an access window when someone had been scheduled in Jason's team's sprint. The copy in the client's inbox matched our decks in every conceptual turn, right down to a placeholder image that only appeared in our draft while still rough. Someone had taken our work, repackaged it, and seeded it where it would hurt most. Marcus, steady, methodical Marcus, who thought in directories and commit messages, sounded a little like a person who had just realized he'd been lied to his entire career. They didn't just leak it, he said. They curated it. Whoever did this planted breadcrumbs to make it look like we lifted from an outside source. Who would gain from that? Piper asked. She didn't need to vocalize the answer. We all knew. Jason liked to win by suffocating anyone who threatened his line. Rachel had a talent for making plausible accusations sound inevitable. They had motive and opportunity. Suspicions are not guilt, but they are dangerous things when combined with an eager narrative. We compiled the dossier into a packet and scheduled a meeting with Linda. It was practical. Present the facts, request an investigation, expect an internal audit. It was also, in the strange economy of corporate life, a way to assert that we weren't going to be casualties. We walked into her office with copies clutched like armor. Linda read the packet slowly. Her face was an expert's map, tight, careful. When she finally looked up, she reminded me why she was where she was. If what you're telling me is true, you have a case. But perception matters as much as fact. The client is jittery. Until we can verify, they're going to want a team they trust implicitly. The phrase itself, trust implicitly, was like a glass bell rung in the middle of a war zone. We had all the forensics on our side, I thought. But any sane executive will weigh the client's comfort against messy internal truth. It wasn't malice, it was survival. Corporations leave people behind all the time in the name of confidence. We asked for assurance that the investigation would be swift, transparent, and protective. Linda set timelines and an HR contact. She said the work would be audited by a neutral third party. She promised discretion and then, with a realism that made my stomach tighten, she added, "But I'm not going to promise you the outcome you'll want." We left the office with a calendar of meetings and a mutual, brittle hope. For a few days, the company ran like a patient on a drip. Procedures were followed, emails were exchanged, and we all waited for the lab results to come back. The client grew more reserved in calls, and their questions, at first curious, shifted toward a quiet suspicion. Jason and Rachel kept their faces schooled in neutral civility. The rest of the office began to treat us like a rumor that might flare into flame. Then, as if pulled by some precise choreography, Evidence that favored our innocence arrived, except it didn't land cleanly. An archival copy we had assumed secure showed a separate set of edits from an account that had been scrubbed. Marcus tracked the scrubbed account to credentials that had been shared internally. Apparently, a common practice by someone who liked shortcuts. The login trace led, eventually, to a pattern of use that implicated a machine on Jason's team. We brought this to HR with a packet, and HR, efficient and cautious, opened an inquiry. And then everything shifted in the way that corporations like to say things shift, which is to say in slow motions that feel like sudden earthquakes to the people underfoot. The client, nervous and revenue-minded, elected to place parts of the Phoenix campaign into the hands of another office while the investigation continued. It was a tactical move for them, but a crushing one for us. Our work, what we'd poured hours of argument and intuition into, was being parceled out. The account manager framed it as a temporary measure. To me, it felt like an erasure. Blair's face, the next morning, had the kind of vertical hardness that comes when someone decides to stop bargaining with fear. She was quieter than she had been for weeks, her shoulders drawn forward like someone bracing for a fall. When she spoke, she chose words as if they were tools only for things that must be built. "I can't watch them use our intimacy as a narrative," she said, shadows under her eyes from a night of not sleeping. "I don't want to be the thing people speculate about to excuse cutting us out." "What do you mean?" My voice was too calm, the kind that doesn't want to betray the way my chest had started to hollow. "I mean, people will say they must have been in collusion. Look how close they are. They'll make our relationship into the evidence for incompetence. They'll weaponize us." Her hands were steady. Her eyes were hard with the kind of anger that could be protective or destructive. "I can't let them make me smaller by making us scandalous." I reached for the obvious answer: fight, publicize, hustle for vindication. But there was a tremor in my own resolve I hadn't noticed before. My instinct had always been to lay out the evidence and trust the system to correct itself. But that system had already decided that appearances mattered more than the messy truth. It was a lesson I had learned in fragments my whole life. Protection often required assimilation. "I will fight this for us," I said. The words had a taste of something like promise. "I don't want to be fought for," she replied. "I want to be someone you run with, not behind." There are moments when you are forced to choose between the known route and the one that frightens you. I had rehearsed many of those in my head, but they had been tactics. Decisions about markets, not about people. The thing Blair was asking was not for me to choose a strategy. She was asking me to choose a life that didn't look like the one I'd planned. Over the next few days, the investigation unfolded with the procedural choreography of an accident report. HR interviewed people. Marcus produced more logs. Someone in legal leaned toward a finding that would absolve us, but legal also spoke in the language of risk and precedent. The client remained skittish. Management, which had once cheered our correctives, now tiptoed around them. In the middle of all this, our work, our late-night edits, our creative alchemy, was being shepherded into the hands of someone else better able to reassure now. Blair's resignation letter arrived like a physical thing. A short paragraph, without flourish, mailed at 9:30 in the morning with a CC to Linda and HR. She didn't send it impulsively. She had thought it through between sleepless hours and long walks. It read, in the quiet way she wrote everything, that she could not continue to be part of a team that would allow her integrity and safety to be compromised for the sake of optics. She thanked the company, she expressed hope for the project's success, and then she ended with a polite but irrevocable goodbye. When I read it, my initial reaction was practical. Petition, negotiation, don't let her walk. But practicality, that old scaffolding of my life, suddenly felt like a thin floor over a deep drop. I called her and she didn't pick up. I paced the office in that noiseless way strategy people pace, one foot in front of the other, counting steps by the spreadsheets I had left open. My mouth tasted like stale coffee and regret. I wanted to do the things I knew how to do, craft a message, call a meeting, persuade. Instead, I froze. I filed the chain of custody for our evidence. I attached an addendum to an email. I attended meetings and answered questions with the mechanical precision of someone running on autopilot. Friends told me I was in shock or denial. Pride was a comfortable silence I kept for a few days longer than healthier pride advisable. Blair left in a week. She left like someone taking a clean breath after stepping out of smoke. She placed her sketches in a box, slid the draft cards she had doodled over into a portfolio, and took the keys that fit the loft in a way that made my chest ache. She hugged me with a deliberation that felt like both apology and instruction. Small, firm, brief. She didn't say forever. She didn't need to. The act of leaving had its own statement. When the elevator doors closed and I watched her shoulders recede, I felt the apparatus of my life landmarked on a new axis. Before she left and after. For someone whose default is to predict and manipulate variables, this was an unmodeled outcome. I had allowed strategy to be my language for so long that the fact of being stunned made me feel unskilled. For days after, the office was a place of rehearsed normalcy. Colleagues offered thin smiles. Linda handled the fallout with an executive's combination of candor and measured silence. Jason and Rachel kept their victory quiet, which made it all the worse. We were cleared by the internal audit. Eventually, the logs and third-party analysis showed that the other team had manipulated the metadata and used shared credentials to make our work appear compromised. The system vindicated us, but vindication arrived late and inside a body that had already been bruised. Public reputation is slow to be restored. Gossip doesn't vanish with corrective documentation. The company issued apologies in the form of corporate prose and promises of new policies. But apologies are fragile when someone has to rebuild a life. Blair didn't come back. The purge of certainty had cost the very thing we might have used to weather the storm, the relationship's daily, ordinary presence. We had both danced around disclosure, and when the danger arrived, we had been stripped of the possibility of repairing in public. I told myself I had been practical. I told myself that she had the right to choose safety over the unpredictable chaos that the company might bring next. I told myself a lot of things. Truthfully, I told myself I had failed. Because failing at protecting someone you love feels like treachery in particular. For a while, I became someone who moved through the office in private collapse. I attended status meetings with my eyes in the right place, and my mind cataloging the ways I'd been cowardly. The work, stripped of Blair's color, felt flatter. I started to answer emails less cleverly. I slept poorly. The nights were long rehearsals of every phrase I had not said. Piper finally caught me one Friday afternoon in the stairwell, the place where pragmatic truth often finds a way to people who hide from their own feelings. She was impatient, righteously blunt. "You let the fear of consequence outmaneuver you," she said, 3 levels into a breath. "You made the calculus you always make. You prioritized the thing you call career. You didn't choose to be brave." "Easy for you to say," I muttered. "You don't have the same chart." "Riley," she said, and there's no sugar in Piper's voice. "You chose the safest slide. That wasn't the same as choosing what you loved. Fix it." She handed me her coffee like a weapon and left. Piper's crudity was a gift wrapped in embarrassment. After she left, I did what I had avoided doing for days. I opened my phone to Blair's contact and found that I had never, in the surviving bureaucracy of my dignity, deleted her number. It sat there like a relic. I did what felt ridiculous. I rewound memory to the smallest truths, took a breath, and left a voicemail. I stood in a stairwell to record it because stairwells are places where the voice sounds like a person trying to be honest. "Blair," I said, and my voice shook in the way it does when the strategy finally cedes to fear. "It's me. I'm sorry. I was a coward. I thought keeping quiet was protecting us, and instead, I let the thing that mattered to me the most walk out the door. If you can forgive me, meet me. I'll say more in person, I can't promise I know the right thing to do, but I'm willing to start looking for it if you will. If you'll let me start with you." I left it there. 3 sentences that felt like a map of confession, and then waited for the kind of silence that is not quite empty. The voicemail sat like a small thing I had dared to set in motion. I had no idea whether she would answer. She had changed her number, maybe. She had moved jobs. She had put walls in ways I could not imagine. I did not know if Piper's shove had been enough to pry a heart loose from a cautious shell. I only knew that the next day had to be different. A week passed. Work moved with the sloth of people willing to forget by doing more things. Then, in the middle of a gray Wednesday, my phone buzzed with a message that made my chest stop. "Meet me at the river. Noon. No lawyers. No scripts." Prospect Park's edge is a neutral place. Open sky, joggers, dogs, parents with strollers. It's where people go to be near a city and not part of it all at once. I arrived early and felt something like anticipatory anxiety, a blend of hope and dread. When she arrived, her hair was pulled back in a way that made her face vulnerable instead of shielded. She had on a coat that made the air around her smell faintly of turpentine and winter, and she was carrying a box of things, sketches perhaps, or maybe equipment for a new life. She looked both smaller and fiercer than I remembered. We sat on a bench that felt suddenly too public for the language we needed to speak. For a long beat, neither of us said anything. The river moved in the background like a machine that had its own indifference to human complication. "You left me a voicemail," she said finally. I listened to it 3 times before I could hear properly. I wasn't sure if I should come. Then I thought, if I'm honest with you, I wanted to see if you'd still be the person in the message. "I'm still trying to be," I said. My voice was quieter than when I strategized in meetings. Stripped of armor, confession is a light that shows everything. "I was pragmatic when you needed someone reckless. I'm sorry, Stop," she said. She put her hand over mine. The contact was a tether. "Don't do your polish. I don't want another version of you. I want the messy current." I swallowed. I was terrified of losing what I'd built. Terrified of being written off because of how I loved someone. I thought hiding would keep us intact. I was wrong. I put career over you. Her eyes flicked away, and for a second I saw the damage of the previous months. The humiliation. The hours where our work had been extracted and judged. When she turned her face back to me, there was a defiance that made my throat ache. "I left because I didn't trust them to treat me like a person," she said. "I left because I was too proud to be used like fodder in someone else's optics. I left because I couldn't be the thing that made people comfortable enough to scapegoat me. But I didn't leave because I wanted to be alone." There was a pause. The river filled it in. "You had a chance to run after me and you didn't," she added, not unkind but factual. That stung. It stung me too, I said. I made the choice I always make, measured, safe, and quiet. But I've been thinking about what brave looks like. It looks like telling the truth even when it's not convenient. It looks like stepping into the unknown with someone else. She laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "You're trying on bravery like a coat." "Maybe I'm just cold," I said. "But if you're willing to try something, if you're willing to let me be messy with you, I'll take that coat." Her laugh softened. She squeezed my hand. "I want to know you'll choose me when there's a real cost," she said. "I don't want performative grand gestures. I want to know that when the world does the worst, and it will, you're not going to fold." "I will choose you," I said, and the words felt heavy with the weight of newness. "Even if choosing you costs me something. Even if it costs me a plan I've been very proud of." We sat together in the public place where everything feels momentarily less consequential, and then she leaned in. There was a small, fierce look in her eyes, like someone making a wager on life. She kissed me then, not tentative this time, but a meeting that acknowledged the risk and accepted it. The kiss was public. Cold air, distant cyclists, a child's shout. But that only made it more genuine. It was long enough to be a decision, and short enough to leave us breathless. "Okay," she said when we pulled apart, smiling in a way that had always been dangerous. "Let's see what choosing looks like." The reconciliation was not theatrical. No cinematic confession on the rooftop. Just two adults making a pact to be less discreet about what they wished for each other. We spoke for hours, too much of it practical. Finances, logistics, how we'd handle questions at the office, what boundaries we needed. We were strategic about romance now, which felt right and absurd at once. We also let ourselves be dumb and soft in small ways. We shared a sandwich, argued about the best railway routes to Brooklyn, and traded playlists that would no longer be contraband. Back at work, the investigation into Jason and Rachel ground forward with the plodding seriousness of people whose careers depended on due process. HR's findings were damning: an internal misuse of credentials, deliberate metadata tampering, and a concerted effort by members of the rival team to undermine ours. The consequences were real. Formal reprimands, suspensions, at least one termination. And while it did not reverse the weeks of damage, it was a kind of justice that required documentation. Linda apologized in person with the awkwardness of someone who recognized the limit of corporate penance. We were not handed back the Phoenix project with trumpets playing. The client had moved on. Relationships had shifted. But the vindication of truth mattered less than the fact we had chosen each other when the world seemed likely to slice us apart. I had been taught that careers are built from single-mindedness and sacrifice. I learned as an adult that some sacrifices could be replaced not by loss, but by choices that led to better alignment. Blair received an offer from a small design house in Brooklyn, one less beholden to the maximalist ambitions of corporate branding and more invested in craft and community. Their terms were fair, their clients interesting, and their culture felt like a place where color did not require permission. Riley Sinclair, strategist, had offers too. Smaller, consulting roles that promised autonomy rather than elevator rides. The things we were offered were not identical to the ones we had imagined, but they were ours. We decided over a late-night takeout feast in her kitchen to take them. Choosing new careers didn't feel like giving up. It felt like cutting away tape from a package and opening space for something we could curate together. Blair's new role meant mornings in a studio that smelled of varnish and coffee. My consulting meant late afternoon sessions at cafes, and the freedom to say no to projects that asked me to compromise more than I wanted. We made choices that aligned with both our talents and our lives. There were small tests, snide comments from colleagues who couldn't reconcile our partnership with the professional narrative they'd told themselves, awkward lunches where Linda's presence felt like an audit. But we met those with a new set of practices: transparency between us, clear boundaries at work, and an agreement to check in with each other about how our public lives were faring. We kept each other accountable not by policing, but by partnership. The months that followed were luminous in the way newly mended things are, bright, a little tender, and quiet in their joy. We rented a small place that felt like a compromise between a loft and a studio, East Light for Blair's work, and a shelf of reference books for my strategic obsessions. Her leather jacket hung on the hook by the door. My keys found a bowl by the window. We made rituals out of small things: mismatched mugs on the counter, an ongoing note titled "To Try" that had entries ranging from "Buy Better Tea" to "Pitch a Collaborative Workshop." The Phoenix Project had not become the career-launching monolith we had once imagined, but it had given us practice. The practice of building something under pressure and protecting it. One morning, months after the resignation and the legal resolutions, I woke to find light pouring through the curtains and the smell of coffee. Blair was at the drafting table, hair in a messy knot, brushing a streak of blue across a new concept board. She looked up as I entered and smiled a small, conspiratorial smile, the same that broke through my defenses in conference rooms 2 winters ago. "You're up early," she said. "You were too," I replied. because truth is an attractive currency in domestic economies. I made us coffee and watched the blue shade catch her cheekbones. It struck me how ordinary the scene felt, and how priceless that ordinariness had become. We had fights about small things, who rinses dishes, who remembers to call the landlord. But they were the good kind of fights, the chlorine-cleansing negotiations of two people calibrating shared life. We had rituals that kept us nimble, monthly date nights where we tried restaurants neither of us had picked before, weekly what-ifs where we fantasized beyond realism, just to remind ourselves that dreaming was permitted. There are items that hold memory for us. Her leather jacket now fits me when I steal it on cold nights. My travel mug is permanently paint-splattered, because Blair uses it as a palette rinse. The loft key sits on a different ring now, a talisman, rather than a secret. We kept one artifact from the old project, a small poster they had used as a mood board. The edges are softened, but the color still makes my chest do that, unfamiliar, soon-to-be domestic flutter. We still argue like people who know each other's weaknesses. She teases me about my spreadsheets, the way they are beautiful but sometimes too quiet. I mock her romantic tendency to name ideas like they're people. But the barbs are soft, a language of intimacy that says we know each other's rough edges and are choosing them anyway. Sometimes, in bed as the city wakes, she brings her hand up to my face and traces a line from temple to jaw, a thumb sweeping old paint flecks off like stardust. "You know," she says, "you were allergic to spontaneity once." "I've been vaccinated," I joke, but the laugh that follows is real. We rebuilt in ways that honored both our vocations. Blair's clients are the kind of people who show up at wine and sketch nights, local restaurateurs, independent publishers, community organizers. My consulting is patchwork and flexible, a nonprofit strategy session here, a pitch exercise there. We collaborate sometimes. Blair's color sensibility and my narrative structure combine into workshops we offer to small brands who want to be brave without losing their ethics. We barter and build. The loss of Phoenix as a corporate launchpad feels less like a failure now, and more like a redirection toward a life that aligns. People ask us, sometimes, about the first kiss against the glass. They want a romantic saga, a moment of dramatic reunion. The truth is, the first kiss was a pivot, not a destination. It cracked something open, and then life poured into the fissure. There was pain, and there was consequence, and there was the slow build of trust that came from not manufacturing fixes but choosing persistence. Sometimes I still think about the maps I used to make. I used to imagine lives as trajectories, a set of lines that, once laid down, were immutable. Loving Blair taught me a different cartography, a kind of map that allows for detours and recognizes that destinations can be reshaped. It taught me that a calculated risk can be courage when chosen out of love. We have days when we're still enemies in very playful ways. A design choice sparks a 5-minute intellectual duel. A strategy debate becomes a flirtation. There is a tenderness to our barbs. The dance that once threatened to undo us now keeps us alive. On a late Saturday in spring, we walk the same stretch of river where we reconciled. The city is softer this time, warmer, and the light caught in the water like some promise. Blair points at a small gallery we're passing and says, half joking, "We should do a show." "We should," I say, and mean both the show and everything behind the line. We stop at a coffee cart. She hands me a cup and our fingers brush. The touch is ordinary and electrifying both. I kiss her there in public, short, fierce, nothing to prove to anyone but ourselves. There is no glass wall anymore. There is no conference room watching. There is only the city, the day, and the decision we keep making, to be each other's people. If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and share your own moments of unexpected love in the comments.